Challenger on rethinking fiscal responsibility around the world.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Just want to make sure we're all here and present. Let's begin. Combating inequality. It remains a key construct of the work that the World Bank, the IMF, and regional multilateral development banks undertake. But reforms are needed. We discussed this a little earlier with Jordan Schwartz, if you were listening, to effectively allocate scarce capital. And with the goal, of course, of sustainable growth and making a more equal society that's resilient to economic shocks. So we want to rethink some of the fiscal policies that we have in place right now. That includes debt. That also includes taxes. That's some of the discussion that we're going to have right now. We want to ensure at the same time that there's a limited reduction in social spending and in pursuit of sustainable development goals. And make sure that the most vulnerable don't get left behind. So what we're going to talk about right now, setting that stage, is how we can do that. What are some of the innovative approaches we can take to reducing that inequality? And there's a range of reforms that have been discussed at the G20 level, at the OECD, et cetera, even in the White House, to target those at highest earning levels to help. So that includes taxing the world's 3,000 richest billionaires, global minimum taxes at the corporate level that was discussed at the OECD, emissions taxes for large corporations, closing loopholes that individuals and corporates use, and tariffs too. So we want to talk about those policies and how we can address inequality. And we are very fortunate to be joined by three leaders who are expert in the topic of this fiscal probity and how we can work on that. So I'd like to introduce them again. Pedro Abramove, to my right, left of me to you, of Open Society Foundations, brings global human rights and democratic lens to questions of inequality and power. And I also want to thank Pedro and OSF for supporting this discussion. That's the reason we're able to have this discussion and one later about debt relief. So thank you so much for making this happen with us, Pedro. Oren Cass, in the middle of American Compass, offers more of a conservative framework to rethink capitalism and focus on workers and their families as well. So thank you for joining us, Oren. And Amy Hanar of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, who brings decades of research on tax policy and advocacy for building a tax system that works for everyone, that's transparent and that's equitable and grounded in data. So thank you all for joining us, and let's get cracking. Pedro, I'd love to start with you if we could. And talk a little bit, let's get right onto that top headline, sexy headline on taxing billionaires. The public debate on taxing billionaires kind of has two sort of splits to it. There's obviously the economic necessity, and then there's sort of the ideological kind of aspect to that. In your view, what's the core purpose of thinking about and discussing taxing billionaires?
I think it's both, right? I don't know if it's ideological, but it's almost moral, right? I think it is so deeply unfair to have this amount of wealth not being taxed and having, the Warren Buffett's classic perspective of him being taxed less than his secretary. I think this is just, it's impossible to justify the function of the state and democracy themselves if we live in democracies that billionaires pay less than workers taxes, but also economically, right? We are in a moment in which we definitely need to create fiscal space for states to be able to address the challenges from climate change to inequality to pandemics, right? And this money needs to come from somewhere. And I think the logic, especially in developing countries, that those challenges will be addressed by increasing and creating more space for indebting developing countries, which has proved not sustainable, needs to shift how we create fiscal space through addressing taxing, right? And who is, where can we find the space to tax people right now? It can't be on the workers. It can't be, again, on the economies and the people of developing countries. But there is the space of the money that is being created in different parts of globally, right? And clearly concentrating in the hands of a few people, and we need to find the ways to tax billionaires exactly to be able to create this fiscal space.
So it's both revenues and fairness, both. Maybe you could just lay out for us the landscape a little bit of income and economic inequality, rather, in the U.S. and around the world a little bit. So we're all talking from the same hymnal. What are the directional trends, and in your view, what are the primary contributing factors? You know, here in the U.S., there's a big political discussion now that it's globalization and trade. So maybe you could just take us back a little bit, and I know that's hard to generalize around the world, but give us your high-level view on that.
I think it's, of course, globalization, and I think mostly globalization more than trade, but it's also the wealth has been creating in some areas of economy that have concentrated, right, and are much less labor intensive and much more and that have, especially the big tech and others that are, and also extractivists in general, that were able to concentrate a lot of wealth and not relying on distributing the wealth to workers, which is the opposite of what happened when industry was the engine of economies in different parts of the world. But what we need to understand is that this, especially if you're talking about one example of kind of big tech, this money is being extracted by the attention, right, of people around the globe, right? And this money is being exactly extracted in a way that it is, and differently from the kind of mineral extraction that, of course, we need to tax more, but they don't pay taxes in the countries in different parts of the world in which they are extracting the money from, right? And I think that's a big part of the discussion. And I think if globalization helped us, right, that it was and we need to pay attention on this, right? The amount of sophistication that was put in place to allow countries to exchange, to have the kind of globalized trade system that we have right now, clearly wasn't put in place to have the collaboration on taxes, right? So the ability of creating and selling goods or extracting from different parts of the world that require a lot of sophistication allowed corporations to evade much more taxes than they did in the past, which also helped them concentrate a lot of this wealth in the hand of few. And I think the challenge that the world has, and I think the OECD with the proposal to challenge to minimum tax on big corporations it's a good starting for the debate. The challenge is we need to put the same sophistication in place also to allow countries to globally tax corporations and people who are globally creating revenue in different parts of the world.
Which was some of the efforts undertaken last year, the past couple of years on the OECD front with Janet Yellen and the like. Very interesting. I'd love to, Oren, bring you into the conversation, and I'll ask you a question, but then I want to just kind of give a little bit of background on what's happening here and some of the discussion very recently in the past few weeks that's taken place in and around the White House. So the question I'd love to ask you is around, from a conservative, pro-market perspective, is there a case for taxing extreme wealth, and if it's harming economic dynamism and hollowing out the middle class and creating inequality? But as a background to that, this has, even though, and we'll get into a little bit of politics here, that wasn't really the goal of the discussion, of course, but it's worth bringing up. There was discussion of a millionaire tax coming out of the White House, which is generally antithetical to Republican doctrine, but this was being pushed by Steve Bannon even, and this news kind of came out yesterday because President Trump said we are not considering that's not something that's going to be included in this upcoming tax and spending bill. The idea was to raise the top marginal rate and to quiet some of the Democratic dissent that the rich are getting away with not being taxed. But a lot of people were surprised that it got this far, even this discussion that allowed to go on. And I was looking at this last night, prepping for this discussion, and I get to the end of an article in the Wall Street Journal, and there's a quote from Oren Cass. It's very encouraging to see politicians now actually working through that logic instead of being paralyzed that there are things they're not allowed to talk about or consider. So I'd love to hear you elaborate on that a little bit and your thoughts on that paradigm.
Yeah, sure. I think the place to start is it's important to recognize how far the Republican Party and the conservative movement has come really over the last 8 years. I mean, if you think back, it's almost hard to think back to the Trump tax cut debate in 2017, where it was simply assumed Republicans will vote for this. They don't really care how big it is. They will say it's going to pay for itself, and that's just what's going to happen. That's not the case anymore. They are struggling mightily to find any way, even just to extend the thing most of them already voted for once. And in fact, I think it's very unlikely that on a party line vote they are going to find a package that can actually meet all of those conflicting considerations. The millionaire tax piece of it, or letting the top rate go back up, I think fits exactly into that framework, which is you've now essentially heard everybody say, yes, if that would solve our problem, we are open to doing it. I mean, the number of trial balloons you've seen floated by Trump himself, Bessent said they're open to it. Jody Arrington, chair of the Budget Committee, Tom Cole, chair of the Appropriations Committee, have both said any deal, bigger picture on budget, probably needs to include more revenue. Chip Roy, chair of the House Freedom Caucus, policy chair of the House Freedom Caucus, has said he's open to higher corporate tax rate. And you even got to the point where you had senators on the record disclosing what Trump had said at an off-the-record meeting, just to make clear how seriously everybody was considering it. Now, the reality is that if that doesn't get them across the finish line and they still can't get a package even with that, what's the point in going there? But I think it's pretty clear from everybody at this point that if that is the thing that would get the deal done, there is no sort of ideological barrier to going there. And so that's a huge shift. And you see it playing out in taxes specifically. You see it playing out more broadly. I've been pointing people to a fascinating thing that happened last week. A private equity firm announced it was going to shut down a paper plant in Chillicothe, Ohio. And Mike DeWine, governor of Ohio, sort of put out the standard, this is extremely disappointing, we will help these workers kind of statement. Next day, Bernie Moreno, one of the newest members of the Senate, sent a 4-page letter to the private equity firm threatening them with everything under the sun if they didn't keep the plant open, and then showed up at the plant the next day with the head of the local labor union for a rally to attack the private equity firm and keep the plant open. Mike DeWine showed up as well, and by Saturday morning, Mike DeWine was posting a video celebrating this rally and that it had forced the private equity firm to committing to keep the plant open. So the momentum and future of the Republican Party and the conservative movement is entirely away from the sort of hardcore, we just cut taxes, whatever happens in the market is going to work out well ideology. That being said, it's really interesting to hear the sort of global billionaires tax take and to say, like, anything along those lines is completely dead on arrival. Certainly on the right of the center in the United States, I think, frankly, just broadly within the United States at this point. And so, especially when you're thinking about these kinds of inequality questions, there's a dichotomy between inequality within countries and inequality globally.
Right.
And the U.S., I think, is shifting heavily toward more concern about inequality within the country, regardless of what that means globally. That's a trade-off economists pushed with globalization very hard in one direction, and it is now, I think, inevitably going to get pushed very hard the other way.
That's a really interesting way to think about that. Thank you for those thoughts. Amy, let's get you and ITEP involved. So ITEP is a U.S. domestic policy tax institute, and you actually have a keen focus on state taxation. So you have a lot of understanding and knowledge of this and experience. And the question I want to ask you is, how do states address, well, let me back up a little bit. President Trump actually cited yesterday the reason for whether, real or an excuse for not undertaking this millionaire tax was that we'd have capital flight. Millionaires would leave the country. And from a state level, this happens all the time in the U.S., where states on the income tax side will tempt billionaires and businesses to Florida, Texas, et cetera, to low tax environments. And I'm just kind of curious how states address these concerns about capital flight and avoidance when proposing stricter taxes on the wealthy and on businesses.
Yeah, well, the evidence is that there's very little migration based on the top tax rate in states. And while Florida may make a big deal of sort of one anecdote, the plural of anecdote is not data, and the fact is that the vast majority of very wealthy people in this country live in New York and California, two states that have relatively higher rates of taxation on that kind of income. And so we've seen a lot of really exciting progress in the states on both capital gains taxation and top rate taxation, and I don't think that there's any real threat it is very clear that states will raise more from wealthy people by raising those rates than they might lose
the net
from
gain
one,
would be positive.
From one prominent person making a big deal out of moving. And the other thing that I would say is that when states do tax wealthy people and corporations, they are able to invest in things that not only help their communities, but actually help make them more appealing places for business investment because they have a more educated population, they have better infrastructure, and they have more of the things that everyone needs to thrive.
Great. Understanding that, as mentioned, you have this focus on U.S. and state tax issues, I'm wondering if you have a view on some of the global discussions around the billionaire tax. Let's bring this back out to the globe. There's been discussions of a billionaire tax at the global level, global minimum tax on billionaires, and promise of pitfalls of global action and enforcement and all that sort of thing. What's your understanding of the status of that, where that sits right now, and what are those pitfalls?
Well, I think that there have been three really exciting things discussed globally: the global corporate tax, which Pedro referenced, the billionaires tax that you're talking about, and also sort of emissions taxes or carbon taxes that are being negotiated globally. And the U.S. put a lot of effort into the global corporate tax, and I think that the really clear thing is that a lot of countries are going to move in the right direction on these, and they're going to do so without the cooperation of the United States is the very likely scenario. And that will be to our deficit, to the deficit of this country in the long term. So what I am seeing is that I think some 140 or 160 countries have moved forward on the global corporate tax, including Europe, Canada, Brazil, Japan. And what that means is that they will raise revenue from multinational corporations, revenue that we could be raising here and that will instead go to help the citizens of Germany, of France, of Japan. And so, that's our loss, and that's unfortunate. And we could, I'm grateful to Oren for raising the fact within the Republican Party that we could be making very different choices, and it would not only do very little to reduce the wealth of those at the top, but it would do a lot for our communities.
Interesting. Pedro, it would be great to get your take on that and what are some of the examples that have worked globally or that are working. And I wanted to bring up Spain. So Spain has a featherweight tax on the wealthy. I think it's somewhere in the 1.7 to 3.5% tax on the 0.5%, 0.5% wealthiest of its population. And there was an analysis done on, countries, 172 countries could raise over $2 trillion annually by copying that example of Spain. And I'm wondering if Spain provides an example of a wealth tax that might work. Let's just start there.
Yeah, I think the Spanish case is definitely one that I think needs to inspire other countries, and I think it has. It's a good example that capital won't disappear. It is much more the opportunity investments that is important. I think Latin America now, it's an interesting example because if you take the first kind of wave of progressive governments in Latin America, most of the kind of redistribution of wealth was based on kind of the price of commodities and cash transfer programs. And right now, the global situation is different. So a lot of the countries are betting much more in tax reforms. Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and now Brazil. Brazil is proposing and has been able both to include the billionaire tax in the final G20 statement, but internally has just proposed a reform that is exempting all the middle class from income taxes and putting a tax on people who earn more than $1 million, which is $200,000, right? And being able to create income tax in that way. And that's the kind of proposal that is putting tax justice, I think, at the center of the debate. I think the other point is not only the examples of success, but I think it's the examples, we need to be careful with the examples of failure, right?
And Chile has an example of that didn't work out.
Exactly. Chile, I think it was a pity because they had a very progressive reform that failed to pass by 2 votes, and I think affected deeply the political ability for the government exactly to create fiscal space to address the demands. But still on the failure, I think there is, and to take your point on the point that the U.S. is taking globally, which is maybe some advances in creating fiscal capacity internally and recognizing that there is a need to create fiscal capacity internally, but opposing that globally. And we saw in Secretary Bessent's speech this idea that the IMF right now needs to bet again, right, in countries that are doing austerity reforms like Argentina as a way to preserve the capitals. But I think what's missing is we've tried that before, right? And austerity as a way to make countries be good, payers of their debts didn't work, right? We need to help countries to create the fiscal capacity to be able to be good payers of their debts instead of just betting on the austerity. So I think it's also important that the U.S. As a creditor in the world thinks of what are the mechanisms to create fiscal capacity in countries, if it's not to create justice around the world, but at least as a creditor, what is the possibilities to create fiscal capacity in developing countries too.
If we could just talk about that for a second, what are some of the new ideas that that might exist? I mean, there's a lot of mineral wealth. You were just talking about commodity driven economies, that brought their wealth in that way. Is there an opportunity there to capitalize on that and create more of a barrier? You talked about big tech and the fact that there's extraction of value, which is not from a mineral base, but from a transactional base. What are some of the ways we can work through those paths like that to come up with innovative fiscal solutions?
I think those are excellent examples. I think beyond the minimum tax for big corporations, but those are 2 sectors that clearly we need to be rethought in the way we tax them, right? It's clearly not effective globally to have an economy that is based on extracting wealth from different parts of the world towards a small group of people, and that's clearly not taxed fairly. But on critical minerals, there's a completely reshift of the value of minerals in different parts of the world. And the way in which, especially in places like Africa, this is re-regulated, and that we can see that as an opportunity for countries to create the fiscal capacity. If we are thinking about debt in Africa, for example, and again, the conversation goes all on austerity and not on how can we use the wealth and the opportunity that they have with critical minerals to create fiscal capacity to the continent to respond to that. We are clearly not taking advantage of the current opportunity and repeating the same failures that from the past.
Interesting. Let's stick with innovation for a second, and Oren will ask you a question about this. The classic knock on progressive taxes is that it stifles innovation. It takes away incentive to invest. What's a policy design that you think balances incentives for success, but limits the excess that we're seeing that drives that? I don't know if you have any notions for how to do that. Maybe we could talk about tariffs in this in this part of the discussion. I don't know.
Well, I don't think the incentive problem is a significant one at these tax levels, and I think this is something the U.S. has certainly seen. When Ronald Reagan was reducing tax rates in 1981, and you had personal rate of 70%, corporate capital rate in 40s and 50s, bringing those down significantly, the share of the proceeds of your creation that you get to keep changes dramatically. There's real elasticity there. When you're fighting about whether the top individual rate should be 37 or 39.6, or the corporate rate should be 21 or 25, the reality is that people don't even know high-income people, there was a fantastic scene when they were debating TICJA. Actually, there were two. One was some very rich person was making the case for why we had to keep rates low. And the moderator just asked him, well, what is your marginal tax rate? He didn't know. And then there was the Wall Street Journal CEO's conference. I think it was Gary Cohn was making the case. We had to do this to boost investment. Moderator just turned out to the audience and said, how many of you are going to base your investment decisions or increase your investment if we, lower the corporate tax rate? Like, one or two people raise it. And Gary Cohn's there on stage. He literally says out loud, why aren't more of you raising your hand?
There's not enough.
And the answer is because that's not what's driving these decisions. I do think, though, that the flip side, and I think this is where we start to get a little loosey-goosey in talking about fiscal capacity and how we solve these problems, is that, certainly in the U.S., it is already these folks who do pay all of the taxes that we do collect. And so you can say, well, we would like to collect even more from these folks, but at the end of the day, if you just think of it in macro terms, what we're coping with, again, certainly in the U.S. to an extent around the world, is just an imbalance between consumption and production.
Right.
And a lot of people trying to borrow money to fill that gap. And at some point, if everybody is trying to borrow money to fill that gap, the only people who can fill it are the large private pools of wealth. And so you can say, well, we would like to collect that as tax revenue instead of borrow it from you. Fair enough, but if you actually want to get onto a sort of firmer footing, there is a fundamental question of how do you either produce more or consume less. And I think that's where, exactly to your point about something like tariffs, exactly where this debate is going on in the US, there is a real fundamental question of, have we turned the dial too far in the consumption direction? Because everybody loves consumption, but at the point where most of what economists are calling investment is actually buying treasuries that's just being laundered into entitlement payments to be consumed, you do build up the debt, but you don't actually have any capital growth underneath it. And so I think whether you're talking about a situation like Argentina or whether you're talking about the US, the fundamental question is, are we actually going to pursue a set of policies that channels more capital into investment that will build long-term productive capacity instead of just finding ways to boost consumption today at the expense of the future?
Because the American dream is not about buying cheap stuff, was what we've heard. One of the quotes from I believe it was Secretary Besson. That's great, Oren. Great macro take. Amy, a kind of interesting construct here is around that messaging and how you make people understand that. And I think kind of the classic sort of tax the rich with pitchforks and torches messaging gets the pushback. I'm just kind of curious your take on how to message that. What works best to build bipartisan public support for these types of efforts on the tax side?
Well, I mean, taxing rich people and corporations is in fact extremely popular. And, that's why Steve Bannon was sort of worried to see these huge crowds at AOC and Bernie's anti-oligarchy rallies and wanted to float the notion that Republicans would consider taxing millionaires. I wish that Oren was right, but I think that we need to look at what they do and not what they say. They float that idea often and they never come through on it.
It's not that they float that idea often until 2024.
Donald Trump floated in 2016 that he was going to make a tax code that would make him pay much more. And in fact, what he did was to dramatically increase the regressivity, to cut taxes for the wealthiest, and make our tax code much more unequal. And now with the tariffs, which I know you're a big proponent of, those are incredibly regressive. They're going to raise taxes on the bottom by over 6%, on middle-class people by more than 5%. We have brand new numbers at itep.org on this. And, Donald Trump's overall tax plans will cut taxes of the top 1% by more than $36,000. So that's extremely unpopular, but Republicans do it because they're beholden to a set of, to a coalition that requires that they do that. And in return, they give working class people, sort of cultural rhetoric. So I think that it is not hard to message tax the rich. Most people are for that. I think it's hard to follow through on it for Republicans, and it's hard to follow through on it, frankly, for Democrats, because there are people with power in our economy and in our political democracy who prevent that from happening. But it's extremely popular.
So the messaging is continue the messaging, and we'll get both sides of the aisle there. We have 20 seconds left. This is a big question. I want to finish up with you, Pedro. You're here helping us have this discussion. I'm just curious your take on what role international institutions and philanthropy have in encouraging fair tax systems globally, but how do you reconcile that with the influence that wealthy donors have in those same spaces and organizations?
Yeah. I think the influence goes both sides, right? And it's, in some ways, it evens out. We can just, I think, once in this country, for example, Citizen United was recognized, right, as the law of the land. It is important that money goes for the different perspectives. I think in terms of global philanthropy, what we are doing, and I think a lot of donors are doing, is supporting groups that locally are pushing the discussion in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, and we are seeing the global debate changing from that, right? The UN convention that was approved a year ago, based on the kind of pressure from African countries and came from African civil society and with the support of Latin America, I think is one example, and this came exactly from the kind of support from bottom up, right? From groups on the ground that are living the consequences of inequality and weak states in their countries.
Great. Well, that's a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate all of your views, diverse views. Fantastic. So I want to thank my panelists, Pedro, Oren, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Please join me. Thank you.